Welcome to another spine-chilling exploration, Verified Fears Family. It's 2:30 a.m. in Cedar Ridge, Montana, and three teenagers have just vanished from their idling car at the mountain overlook, leaving behind open doors, running headlights, and no footprints in the fresh snow. Tonight, we're diving into 11 documented mysteries that have torn apart small communities across America, where entire congregations wake up with missing memories, children speak ancient languages they've never learned, and families disappear without explanation. These aren't folklore or urban legends, Verified Fears Family, but real events that left investigators baffled and residents questioning everything they thought they knew about their quiet towns. From the phantom radio broadcasts in Wyoming to the underwater house that shouldn't exist in Michigan, each mystery will make you wonder what secrets might be lurking in your own neighborhood. So turn off the lights and prepare for 11 cases that prove sometimes the most terrifying mysteries happen in the places we least expect them. My name is Jonas, and I've been part of the Cedar Ridge Search and Rescue Team for over 15 years. In all those years responding to missing hikers, stranded climbers, and lost hunters in these Montana mountains, nothing prepared me for what happened on October 14th, 2019. That night changed everything I thought I knew about the wilderness I'd spent my entire life exploring. And it's a case that still keeps me awake some nights, staring at the ceiling and wondering what really happened up on that overlook. The call came in around 4:30 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. Mrs. Walsh, whose 17-year-old son, Augustine, hadn't come home the night before, had driven up to the scenic overlook where teenagers often went to hang out. What she found there made her immediately call 911. Augustine's Honda Civic was sitting at the edge of the parking area with the engine still running, driver's door wide open, and the headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like two desperate beacons. When my team arrived at the scene 20 minutes later, the first thing that struck me was how eerily preserved everything looked. The car had been idling for what we later determined was at least 6 hours. Based on fuel consumption and witness statements from the last people who'd seen the three teenagers alive. The radio was still playing softly, some local country station that Augustine apparently liked, and his wallet sat on the passenger seat with $43 cash and his driver's license still inside. Dominic's baseball cap was on the dashboard, the one he wore to every single game at Cedar Ridge High, and in the back seat we found Roberto's distinctive leather jacket, the expensive one his parents had bought him for his 16th birthday. Three teenagers from three different families, all missing without a single clue about where they'd gone or why they'd abandoned a perfectly functioning vehicle in the middle of nowhere. The overlook itself sits about 8 miles outside of town, connected by a winding mountain road that most locals know like the back of their hand. It's a popular spot during the day for tourists wanting to photograph the valley below. But at night, it becomes a gathering place for teenagers looking for somewhere private to hang out away from parental supervision. The area is surrounded by dense pine forest on 3 sides, with only the scenic drop-off providing any kind of view. When we examined the immediate area around the car, we found something that still gives me chills to think about. Fresh snow had begun falling around midnight that night, according to weather reports, which meant there should have been footprints leading away from the vehicle if the teenagers had walked anywhere. But there were no footprints at all, not even around the car doors or in the immediate vicinity where someone might have stood talking or smoking. The investigation that followed consumed the next 3 months of my life. We organized search parties that included over 200 volunteers from surrounding communities, brought in tracking dogs from Billings, and even had the state police helicopter conduct aerial sweeps of the entire area. Every cave, every ravine, every possible hiding spot within a 20-mile radius was searched methodically. The dogs picked up the teenagers' scent around the car, but the trail went cold within 50 feet of the vehicle, as if Augustine, Dominic, and Roberto had simply vanished into thin air. FBI specialists examined the car and found no signs of struggle, no blood evidence, no indication that anything violent had occurred. The teenagers' cell phones were all accounted for, left behind in the vehicle. But the last text messages sent were typical teenage conversations about meeting up and hanging out. Nothing that suggested they were planning to disappear or that they felt threatened in any way. What made the case even more perplexing were the witness statements we collected from other teenagers who had been at the Overlook earlier that evening. According to several independent accounts, Augustine, Dominic, and Roberto had arrived around 9:30 p.m. and had been socializing with a larger group of about 12 other kids from their school. Everyone described the evening as completely normal. People talking, laughing, sharing snacks, playing music from car stereos. Around 11:15 p.m., most of the group decided to head home because of the dropping temperature and the light snow that had begun falling. The three missing teenagers had specifically told their friends that they were planning to stay a little longer, maybe another half hour, before driving back to town. Multiple witnesses confirmed that Augustine, Dominic, and Roberto were in good spirits, not acting strangely, and hadn't mentioned any plans other than eventually going home. The families were devastated, as you might imagine. Augustine's mother started a social media campaign that spread across Montana and into neighboring states, sharing photographs and details about the disappearance. Dominic's father, a local mechanic, spent weeks driving mountain roads at all hours, convinced he might spot some clue that the official search had missed. Roberto's parents hired a private investigator from Denver who specialized in missing persons cases. But even with his resources and experience, no new leads emerged. The community rallied around the families in ways that reminded me why I love living in a small town. But underneath all the support and solidarity was a growing sense of unease that something truly inexplicable had happened. As months passed without any breakthrough, theories began circulating throughout Cedar Ridge and the surrounding area. Some people suggested the teenagers had run away together, perhaps planning to start new lives somewhere far from Montana. But this theory never held water because none of them had taken any personal belongings, money beyond what was in Augustine's wallet, or even winter clothes appropriate for surviving outdoors. Others wondered if they might have been victims of a crime, perhaps kidnapped by someone passing through the area. But again, the complete lack of evidence or witnesses made this seem unlikely. The most disturbing theory, whispered in coffee shops and discussed in hushed tones at town meetings, was that something supernatural had occurred at the Overlook, that the teenagers had encountered something beyond our understanding. This supernatural theory gained unexpected credibility when we discovered that the Cedar Ridge Overlook had a history of unusual incidents dating back several decades. Local newspaper archives revealed that in 1987, a couple had reported seeing strange lights moving through the forest near the Overlook, lights that appeared to be following some kind of intelligent pattern. In 1994, a family camping in the area had called authorities to report hearing voices calling for help from the woods. But search teams found no one and no evidence of people in distress. Most significantly, in 2003, another teenager had gone missing from the same general area, though that case had eventually been solved when the young man was found 3 days later suffering from hypothermia and memory loss. Claiming he had no recollection of where he had been or what had happened to him. The case officially remains open, though active investigation ceased after the first year when every possible lead had been exhausted. Augustine Walsh, Dominic Morrison, and Roberto Chen are still listed as missing persons in state and federal databases, and their photographs still hang in the Cedar Ridge Sheriff's Office alongside other cold cases. Their families have never stopped hoping for answers, never stopped believing that someday they might learn what happened to their children on that cold October night. The overlook itself has been permanently closed to public access, with barriers installed to prevent vehicles from reaching the parking area where the Honda Civic was found. I still drive past that road sometimes when I'm heading to other search and rescue calls in the mountains. And I always slow down when I see the turnoff. Part of me wonders if we missed something crucial in those early days of the investigation, some piece of evidence that might have explained everything. But another part of me, the part that has spent decades in these mountains and has learned to respect their mysteries, suspects that what happened to Augustine, Dominic, and Roberto might be beyond the reach of conventional investigation. Sometimes the wilderness keeps its secrets, and sometimes people vanish into stories that will be told around Cedar Ridge for generations to come. I'm Jamari Thompson, and for 6 years, I worked as a night security guard at various industrial sites around New Hampshire. Most people think security work is boring. Sitting in a booth, checking cameras, walking perimeters, and 99% of the time they're right. But that 1%, when something genuinely strange happens, it stays with you forever. What I experienced at the old Millbrook textile mill between 1987 and 1993 changed how I think about the boundary between the living and the dead. And even now, 30 years later, I can still hear those voices echoing in my memory. The Millbrook Mill had been closed since 1976, when the textile industry finally abandoned New Hampshire for cheaper labor markets overseas. The building was a massive brick structure from the 1920s, 5 stories tall with hundreds of windows, most of them boarded up or broken. The company that owned the property hired security services to prevent vandalism and copper theft, which was becoming a serious problem with abandoned industrial buildings throughout New England. My shift ran from midnight to 8 in the morning, 7 days a week. And for the first 3 months, everything was exactly as routine as you'd expect. I'd walk the perimeter, check the doors, monitor the basic alarm system, and spend most of my time reading paperback novels or listening to overnight radio shows. The mill's security setup was pretty primitive by today's standards, but sophisticated for the late 1980s. There were motion sensors on all the ground floor entrances, pressure plates under certain floorboards near valuable equipment that hadn't been removed. And most importantly, an audio recording system that activated whenever any of the sensors detected movement inside the building. The idea was that if someone broke in, we'd have a recording of their activities that could be used as evidence for prosecution. The system used standard cassette tapes that I was supposed to change out weekly and deliver to the main office for storage. For 3 months, those tapes contained nothing but the occasional mouse scurrying across a sensor or the building settling in the New Hampshire cold. Everything changed on January 15, 1988, when I arrived for my shift and discovered that the recording system had activated sometime around 3:17 a.m. the previous night. This wasn't unusual in itself. The sensors were sensitive enough to be triggered by large rats or even sudden temperature changes. But when I played back the tape to check what had caused the activation, I heard something that made my blood run cold. There were voices inside that empty building, clear as day, having what sounded like a normal conversation about work schedules and production quotas. The voices belonged to 2 men, and they were discussing things like the morning shift changeover and getting those looms back online before the supervisor noticed. Conversations that would have made perfect sense in 1975, but were impossible in an abandoned building that had been sealed for over a decade. I immediately called my supervisor, thinking there might be homeless people who had somehow gotten inside and were using the mill for shelter. We conducted a thorough search of the entire building that morning, checking every floor, every room, every possible hiding place or entry point. The building was completely empty, with no signs that anyone had been inside recently. All the doors were still locked from the outside, the windows were either boarded shut or too high to reach without equipment. and there were no footprints in the dust that covered most of the interior floors. Even more puzzling, the conversations on the tape referenced specific machinery and work areas using terminology that we later confirmed was accurate for the mill's operations in the 1970s, but would be impossible for random intruders to know. The phenomenon repeated itself exactly 7 days later, again at 3:17 a.m., and again the following week at precisely the same time. The voices were always the same two men, though we could never make out enough detail to identify specific individuals. Sometimes they talked about production schedules, sometimes about union meetings, occasionally about personal matters like family problems or weekend plans. The conversations always lasted between 12 and 18 minutes, and they always ended abruptly, as if the speakers had simply walked away from the recording equipment. I started timing my rounds to be inside the building at 3:17 a.m., hoping to catch whoever was responsible, but the voices never occurred when I was physically present, only when the building was supposedly empty. After 2 months of weekly recordings, I began researching the mill's history at the Millbrook Public Library, trying to understand what I was hearing. The mill had employed over 400 people at its peak in the early 1970s, working 3 shifts around the clock to meet orders for military contracts during the Vietnam era. I found newspaper articles about workplace accidents, labor disputes, and eventually the gradual decline that led to the mill's closure. Most significantly, I discovered that 2 workers, Seth Morrison and Saul Chen, had died in an industrial accident in March 1974 when a steam pipe burst on the 3rd floor, scalding both men before help could arrive. The newspaper described Seth as a shift supervisor who had worked at the mill for 15 years, and Saul as a newer employee who was training to operate the industrial looms. Armed with this information, I started paying closer attention to the recorded conversations, and the details became increasingly disturbing. The voices often discussed events and people that matched historical records of the mill's operations in the mid-1970s. They mentioned supervisors by name, complained about specific machinery that had documented maintenance problems, and even referenced local news events from that time period. Most chilling of all, the conversations occasionally included discussions about safety concerns with the steam heating system, with one voice repeatedly warning the other about pressure readings that seemed dangerously high. It was as if I was listening to recordings of conversations that had taken place over a decade earlier, somehow preserved and replaying every week at the exact time when Seth Morrison and Saul Chen had died. Word about the recordings spread throughout the small community of security guards, maintenance workers, and local officials who had any connection to the mill property. Some people dismissed the whole thing as an elaborate hoax, suggesting that someone was using radio equipment to broadcast fake conversations that the recording system was picking up. Others theorized that the building's acoustics or electrical systems were somehow replaying old conversations, though no one could explain how such a thing might be technically possible. A few individuals, particularly older residents who had worked at the mill or known people who had, became convinced that we were dealing with something supernatural. The voices of dead workers somehow trapped in the building where they had spent so much of their lives. The local newspaper ran a story about the phenomenon in October 1990, which brought unwanted attention from paranormal investigators, curiosity seekers, and researchers from universities throughout New England. The property owners, concerned about liability and bad publicity, initially refused to allow outside investigators access to the building or the recordings. However, after pressure from local officials and growing media coverage, they eventually permitted a team from the University of New Hampshire's psychology department to study the tapes and conduct their own investigation. The researchers spent 3 months analyzing the recordings using audio equipment far more sophisticated than our simple security system. And their final report confirmed that the voices were genuine human speech, not radio interference or mechanical sounds that might be misinterpreted. The university team also discovered something that I had missed during my nightly vigils. Using sensitive recording equipment, they detected faint background sounds during the 3:17 a.m. episodes that matched the acoustic signature of industrial machinery operating. Looms running, steam pipes hissing, conveyor belts moving. These sounds were far too quiet for the human ear to detect during real-time listening. But they showed up clearly when the recordings were analyzed with computer enhancement. Most remarkably, the machinery sounds matched exactly the equipment that had been operating in the mill during the early 1970s, including several pieces of specialized equipment that had been removed before the building's closure and would be unknown to anyone who hadn't worked there during that specific time period. The recordings continued with mechanical regularity until November 17, 1993, when they stopped as suddenly as they had begun. I was working my usual shift that night, and I positioned myself near the recording equipment at 3:17 a.m. as I had done hundreds of times before. The system activated right on schedule, but instead of the familiar voices of Seth and Saul discussing work matters, there was only silence. Not empty silence, but what sounded like a large space filled with the kind of quiet that comes when machinery stops running and people finish their conversations. After 18 minutes, the recording stopped, and the voices never returned. 2 months later, the mill building was sold to developers who demolished it to build a shopping center. I kept copies of several dozen recordings from those 6 years, and I still have them stored in a safe deposit box at the Millbrook Savings Bank. Occasionally, when people ask me about my experiences as a security guard, I'll mention the mill recordings. But I've learned to be selective about who I tell the full story. Most people aren't ready to accept that the boundary between past and present might be more permeable than we imagine, or that some conversations might echo through time in ways that science hasn't yet learned to explain. But I know what I heard during those long nights at the Millbrook Mill. And I know that Seth Morrison and Saul Chen spent 6 years trying to finish conversations that death had interrupted, until they finally found whatever peace they were seeking in the silence. Name's Andy, West Virginia game warden for the past 23 years. I've seen plenty of fishing accidents, hunting mishaps, and folks getting lost in these mountains. But nothing in my career prepared me for what started happening at Drowning Creek back in 2008. 7 experienced fishermen vanished from that water over the span of 7 years, and despite every resource we threw at the investigation, we never found so much as a tackle box or a boot. The creek earned its name honestly. It's been claiming lives since before my grandfather's time. But what happened between 2008 and 2015 was different. It was methodical. It was impossible. And it changed how every angler in Elkhart County thinks about being alone on the water. Drowning Creek winds through some of the most remote territory in West Virginia, cutting a path through dense hardwood forest and limestone hollows that haven't changed much since Daniel Boone's time. The creek runs cold and clear most of the year, fed by mountain springs and seasonal runoff, with deep pools that hold native brook trout and the occasional brown trout that migrates up from the main river system. It's the kind of water that serious fishermen dream about. Pristine, challenging, and far enough from civilization that you might fish all day without seeing another human soul. That isolation, which made Drowning Creek so appealing to anglers, became the common thread in every disappearance. The first incident occurred on April 12, 2008, when Lionel Patterson failed to return from a solo fishing trip. Lionel was 62 years old, retired from the coal mines, and had been fishing Drowning Creek for over 40 years. His wife called our office when he didn't come home for dinner. which was unusual because Lionel was religiously punctual about meal times. We found his truck parked at the usual access point, a gravel pull-off about 3 miles up Drowning Creek Road from the main highway. His fishing gear was missing, which initially suggested he had made it to the water. But when we followed the well-worn path down to the creek, we found his tackle box sitting open on a flat rock beside one of his favorite pools. His rod and reel were nowhere to be found, and there were no signs of struggle or accident. The water at that spot was only waist-deep, crystal clear, and moving at a gentle pace. Not dangerous conditions for an experienced fisherman. The search for Lionel involved 40 volunteers, 2 tracking dogs, and a helicopter from the state police. We covered every mile of Drowning Creek, from its headwaters down to where it joins the main river, checking every deep hole, every undercut bank, every place where a body might hang up on debris or rocks. The dogs followed his scent from the truck down to the tackle box. But the trail went cold at the water's edge, as if Lionel had simply walked into the creek and disappeared. After 5 days of intensive searching, we had to call off the operation. Lionel's disappearance was classified as a probable drowning, though privately I had my doubts. The water wasn't deep enough or fast enough to sweep away an experienced angler, and Lionel knew every inch of that creek better than most people know their own backyards. 13 months later, on May 23, 2009, we got another call about a missing fisherman at Drowning Creek. This time, it was Garrett Williams, a 34-year-old teacher from Beckley who had been coming to the creek every spring for the past 15 years. His girlfriend reported him missing when he failed to meet her for dinner in town, and she led us to his campsite about half a mile upstream from where we'd found Lionel's tackle box. Garrett's tent was set up properly, his camping gear was organized and undisturbed, but his fishing equipment was gone. We found his fly rod floating in a deep pool 200 yards downstream from the campsite, the line still rigged with a hand-tied dry fly that local fishermen recognized as one of Garrett's specialties. His waders were discovered the next morning, hung carefully on a tree branch beside the creek, as if he had removed them intentionally before going into the water. But Garrett himself was nowhere to be found. The pattern became clear after the third disappearance in August 2010. Every missing fisherman was experienced. Every disappearance occurred during dawn hours when the fishing was best, and every man had been alone when he vanished. The searches always found some piece of fishing equipment, a rod, a tackle box, waders, but never the fisherman himself, and never any evidence of struggle or accident. The locations were spread across different sections of Drowning Creek, ruling out a single hazardous spot or hidden danger that might explain the disappearances. Most troubling of all, the missing men represented a cross-section of the local fishing community. Young and old, locals and visitors, fly fishermen and bait fishermen, experts who knew the creek intimately, and newcomers who were fishing it for the first time. After the fourth disappearance in 2012, I started keeping detailed records of every aspect of each incident, looking for patterns that might explain what was happening. I mapped the exact locations where equipment was found, documented weather conditions, water levels, and seasonal variations, interviewed family members and friends about the missing men's fishing habits and mental states. What emerged from this analysis was deeply unsettling. Every disappearance occurred between 5:30 and 6:45 a.m., always on clear mornings with light wind, always when the water temperature was between 58 and 62 degrees. The missing men had all been fishing alone, which wasn't unusual for serious anglers, but they had all specifically told someone they planned to fish until mid-morning before heading home. None of them had given any indication of personal problems, depression, or reasons they might want to disappear voluntarily. The local community reacted to the disappearances with a mixture of fear, speculation, and determination to solve the mystery. Several fishing guides started refusing to take clients to Drowning Creek, while others organized group expeditions, reasoning that safety lay in numbers. Theories ranged from the practical to the bizarre. Hidden sinkholes that opened and closed unpredictably, a reclusive mountain man who was killing trespassers, even suggestions that something supernatural was hunting fishermen at dawn. The West Virginia Department of Natural Resources brought in experts to survey the creek bottom with sonar equipment, looking for underwater caves or anomalies that might trap bodies. But the surveys revealed nothing unusual. The creek bed was rocky but stable, with no hidden dangers that could account for 7 experienced fishermen vanishing without a trace. In 2014, after the 6th disappearance, local authorities made the unprecedented decision to drain a 2-mile section of Drowning Creek using portable pumps and temporary dams. The operation took 3 weeks and cost over $60,000, but it was the only way to definitively search the areas where the men had vanished. What we found when the water was gone shocked everyone involved in the investigation. The creek bed contained the usual debris: old tires, beer bottles, rusted car parts that had been dumped over the decades. But there were no human remains, no fishing equipment beyond what we had already recovered. No evidence that 7 men had died in that water. The limestone bedrock showed no caves or sinkholes large enough to hide a body, and there were no underwater structures that could trap someone below the surface. The 7th and final disappearance occurred on September 8, 2015, just 3 months after we had refilled the drained section of creek. This time, the missing fisherman was someone I knew personally. Robert Hayes, a retired game warden who had worked these mountains for 30 years before I took over his territory. Robert was one of the most competent outdoorsmen I had ever met. A man who could track a wounded deer through any terrain and who knew every dangerous spot in the county. His disappearance shattered any remaining theories about inexperienced fishermen making fatal mistakes or hidden hazards, claiming victims who didn't know the water well enough to avoid them. Following Robert's disappearance, the West Virginia Department of Natural Resources took the extraordinary step of permanently closing Drowning Creek to fishing. Warning signs were posted at every access point, and the creek was designated as off-limits to all recreational activities. The decision was controversial, with many local fishermen arguing that closing the creek would only add to the mystery and prevent any chance of solving the disappearances. But after 7 men had vanished in identical circumstances, authorities decided that public safety outweighed any other considerations. The creek remains closed today, 10 years later, and is now officially known as Lost Soul Creek on all state maps and documents. I still drive past the access point sometimes when I'm patrolling other areas, and I always slow down to look at the warning signs and the overgrown path that leads down to the water. Part of me wonders if we missed something crucial in all those searches, some clue that might have explained what happened to Lionel, Garrett, Robert, and the 4 other men whose names are engraved on a memorial stone in the Elkhart Town Square. But another part of me, the part that has spent decades in these mountains and learned to respect their mysteries, suspects that some questions aren't meant to be answered. Drowning Creek earned its name long before my time, and maybe it was always going to keep claiming fishermen until we finally accepted that some waters are too dangerous to fish. No matter how beautiful the trout or how peaceful the morning mist rising from the pools. Dr. Skyla here, and I've been practicing medicine in Cornwall, Nebraska for 41 years. In all that time treating everything from farm accidents to seasonal flu outbreaks, nothing prepared me for what happened during the harvest moon of September 1979. That night, 17 of my patients experienced identical nightmares so vivid and disturbing that several of them required sedation. And what we discovered the next morning challenged everything I thought I knew about the relationship between mind and reality. Medical school teaches you to look for rational explanations, to trust in science and logic. But sometimes the evidence points toward conclusions that make you question the very nature of what we call possible. Cornwall has always been a typical farming community. Population hovering around 800 people spread across the agricultural heartland where corn and soybeans stretch to every horizon. September is harvest time, when the fields turn golden and the air fills with dust from combines working dawn to dusk. The harvest moon of 1979 was particularly spectacular, rising like an enormous orange lantern over the endless rows of corn that surrounded our town on all sides. Local farmers had been talking about it for weeks, planning to work late into the night, taking advantage of the extra light to bring in crops before the weather turned. It should have been a celebration of another successful growing season. But instead, it became the most disturbing medical case of my career. The first call came at 3:47 a.m. on September 23rd from Martha Henderson, whose husband Johanna had been thrashing in bed for over an hour, talking in his sleep about walking through cornfields and seeing fire on the horizon. She couldn't wake him up despite shaking him vigorously. And when he finally came to consciousness around 4:15 a.m., he was drenched in sweat and completely disoriented. Johanna described a dream so detailed and terrifying that Martha insisted on driving him to my office immediately, even though it was still dark outside. He told me about walking through endless rows of corn that seemed to stretch forever in every direction, following a path he couldn't see but somehow knew was there. Drawn toward a burning farmhouse that appeared to be miles away, but never seemed to get any closer, no matter how long he walked. Within 2 hours, I had received similar calls from 8 other families throughout Cornwall and the surrounding rural area. Each patient described the same basic dream structure, finding themselves alone in a vast cornfield during what appeared to be late evening or early night, feeling compelled to walk toward a distant farmhouse that was completely engulfed in flames. The details they provided were remarkably consistent. The sound of their footsteps on dried corn husks, the way the moon cast strange shadows between the rows, the smell of smoke that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Most disturbing was their description of the burning house itself. A 2-story white farmhouse with a wraparound porch, a red barn visible behind it, and flames that burned without making any sound, creating an eerie silence that several patients described as more terrifying than any noise would have been. By noon on September 23rd, I had examined 17 people ranging in age from 14 to 73, all reporting identical dream experiences from the previous night. Medical protocol demanded that I consider possible causes for such widespread psychological symptoms. Food contamination, environmental toxins, viral infections that might affect brain chemistry, or even mass hysteria triggered by suggestion and community anxiety. I drew blood samples from every patient, contacted the state health department to report a possible outbreak of unknown origin, and began conducting detailed interviews to identify any common factors that might explain why these specific individuals had been affected while the majority of the community remained unaffected. The blood tests came back completely normal. No trace of hallucinogenic substances, bacterial infections, or chemical poisoning that might cause vivid nightmares or altered consciousness. The patients showed no signs of physical illness, fever, or neurological symptoms beyond the shared dream experience and the lingering anxiety it had produced. What made the case even more puzzling was the randomness of who had been affected. The 17 people came from different families, different age groups, different social circles, with no apparent connections beyond living in the same general area. Some were lifelong residents of Cornwall. Others had moved to the community within the past few years. Some were farmers who worked in cornfields every day. Others were shopkeepers, teachers, or retirees who had minimal contact with agricultural activities. The interviews revealed one detail that sent chills down my spine when I finally recognized the pattern. Every single patient described the burning farmhouse in identical terms, down to architectural details that were far too specific to be coincidental. They all mentioned a distinctive weather vane shaped like a rooster on the peak of the main roof, a stone foundation that was partially visible beneath the flames, and most specifically, a child's swing hanging from an oak tree in the front yard that continued swinging back and forth despite the absence of any wind. When I pressed them for more details, several patients became visibly distressed, describing a growing sense of dread as they walked through the cornfield, as if they were approaching something terrible that they were powerless to avoid. That evening, I decided to research the history of farmhouse fires in our area, thinking that perhaps the patients had unconsciously incorporated memories of a real tragedy into their shared nightmare. What I discovered at the county courthouse made my hands shake as I read through the old records. The Casper Farm, located about 3 miles southeast of Cornwall, had burned to the ground on September 23, 1952, exactly 27 years before the night of the shared dreams. The fire had killed the entire Casper family, parents Frank and Helen, along with their 2 young children, ages 6 and 9. The newspaper account described a 2-story white farmhouse with a wraparound porch, a red barn that had also been destroyed in the blaze, and a distinctive rooster weather vane that had been a local landmark for decades. Contemporary accounts of the 1952 fire included photographs that matched perfectly with the descriptions my patients had provided of the burning house in their dreams. The stone foundation, the oak tree with the child's swing. Even the layout of the buildings and the position of the barn. Every detail corresponded exactly with the Casper property, as it had existed before the fire. Most remarkable of all, several of my patients had described seeing figures in the windows of the burning house. Silhouettes that appeared to be calling for help but made no sound. The 1952 newspaper had reported that the Casper family had been trapped on the 2nd floor when the fire blocked their access to the main staircase, and neighbors who had tried to rescue them had seen them at the upstairs windows before the roof collapsed. I drove out to the former Casper property the next day, following directions from the old county records and asking for guidance from longtime residents who remembered the tragedy. The farmhouse and barn had never been rebuilt after the fire, and the property had remained vacant for over 25 years. What I found there shook me to my core. The stone foundation was exactly as my patients had described it, partially overgrown with weeds and brush, but still clearly visible. The oak tree stood in the front yard, and though the swing had long since rotted away, I could see the deep grooves in the main branch where ropes had worn into the bark over many years. Most disturbing of all, the entire area was surrounded by cornfields that stretched to the horizon in every direction, creating the exact landscape that 17 people had experienced in their identical dreams. The shared nightmare phenomenon occurred again exactly 20 years later, on September 23, 1999, affecting 19 residents of Cornwall and the surrounding area. By then, I was semi-retired, but the current town doctor contacted me immediately when patients began reporting the same vivid dreams of walking through cornfields toward the burning Casper farmhouse. The details were identical to what I had documented in 1979. The silent flames, the rooster weather vane, the child's swing moving in the windless night air. This time, several patients reported seeing the silhouettes of the Casper family more clearly, and 2 individuals claimed they could hear faint voices calling for help, though the words were never clear enough to understand. The most recent occurrence happened on September 23, 2019. Exactly 40 years after my original case and 67 years after the Casper family had died in the fire. 23 people experienced the shared nightmare this time, including several who had moved to Cornwall from other states and had no knowledge of the local tragedy. The current medical staff documented the phenomenon thoroughly, using modern sleep study equipment and brain imaging technology that hadn't been available during my earlier investigations. The results showed that all affected individuals exhibited identical brainwave patterns during REM sleep on the night of September 22nd, 23rd, displaying synchronized neural activity that medical science cannot currently explain. The Cornwall Town Council has officially acknowledged the phenomenon and established a memorial fund for the Casper family, placing a historical marker at the site where their farmhouse once stood. Many residents now plan to stay with relatives in other towns during harvest moon nights that fall on September 23rd, unwilling to risk experiencing the terrifying shared dream that seems to occur every 20 years with mathematical precision. The cornfields still surround the former Casper property, and on clear autumn nights when the moon is full, local people report seeing strange lights moving among the rows of corn, as if someone is carrying a lantern while walking toward the place where a farmhouse burned 67 years ago. I'm 89 years old now, and I've documented this phenomenon for 40 years, but I'm no closer to understanding how 17 people can share an identical dream about events that occurred before many of them were born. Medical science offers no explanation for how the human mind can access memories of tragedies it never witnessed, or how consciousness can transcend individual experience to create collective visions of historical events. All I know for certain is that every 20 years, on the anniversary of the Casper family fire, the past reaches out to touch the present in ways that challenge everything we think. We know about the nature of memory, dreams, and the invisible connections that bind communities together across decades of time. I'm Mercy, and I worked as a student intern at Cray 101.3 FM in Rayfield, Wyoming from 2003 to 2005. It was supposed to be a simple college credit assignment: answer phones, organize music catalogs, help with basic broadcasting tasks in a tiny station that served maybe 3,000 people scattered across cattle ranches and mining claims. What I experienced during those 2 years changed my understanding of what's possible in the realm of human communication. And I still get chills when thunderstorms roll across the high plains and the radio starts crackling with static. Cray was one of those small-town stations that survived on local advertising, farm reports, and playing whatever music the owner felt like hearing on any given day. The station occupied the second floor of an old brick building on Main Street, with our transmitter located on a hill about 5 miles outside of town. Our equipment was ancient, even by early 2000 standards. Mixing boards from the 1980s, turntables that skipped if you walked too heavily across the wooden floors, and a phone system that had been installed sometime during the Carter administration. During severe weather, everything electrical in that building would crackle and pop with interference, which is why nobody paid much attention when the strange calls started during a thunderstorm in October 2003. The first call came in around 2:30 a.m. during my overnight shift, when I was playing classic country music for the handful of insomniacs and long-haul truckers who might be listening. The phone rang with that harsh electronic buzz that meant lightning was interfering with our ancient wiring. And when I answered, the voice on the other end was so distorted by static that I could barely make out the words. The caller said he was lost in the static and needed help finding his way back to somewhere he couldn't quite name. I assumed it was someone with a bad cell phone connection who had dialed wrong during the storm, so I politely explained that he had reached a radio station and suggested he try calling emergency services if he was actually lost. But the caller didn't hang up. Instead, he started talking about people in town in ways that made my skin crawl. He mentioned Johanna Morrison, who ran the feed store and said she was worried about her daughter's college tuition payments, but hadn't told anyone in the family about her financial concerns. He described Mercy Patterson's arthritis acting up because of the changing barometric pressure from the approaching storm, even though Mercy lived alone 15 miles outside of town and rarely discussed her health problems with anyone. Most disturbing of all, he accurately described what I was wearing that night. A green pullover sweater and jeans with a small tear in the left knee. Despite the fact that our studio had no windows facing the street, and it was the middle of the night during a thunderstorm. The calls continued sporadically over the next several months, always during electrical storms, always with the same distorted voice claiming to be lost in the static. The caller demonstrated an impossible knowledge of private details about Rayfield residents. Ongoing family disputes, financial problems, health issues, relationship troubles that people kept carefully hidden from their neighbors. He knew that banker Harold Chen was considering early retirement due to stress-related heart palpitations, that schoolteacher Rita Walsh was having an affair with a married county commissioner, and that elderly rancher Frank Rodriguez had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia, but hadn't told his children because he was afraid they would force him to sell his land. What made the calls truly terrifying wasn't just the impossible knowledge, but the predictions. The voice in the static would casually mention upcoming events in the same conversational tone he used to discuss current gossip. He told me 3 weeks in advance that the Hendricks barn would catch fire during a January snowstorm, providing specific details about how the electrical wiring in the hayloft would short out and ignite stored feed. He predicted that Sarah Williams would break her leg in a skiing accident in Colorado, even though Sarah hadn't told anyone she was planning a ski trip. Most remarkably, he accurately forecasted a flash flood that would wash out the bridge on County Road 47 in April, naming the exact date and time the waters would crest. Every prediction came true, with uncanny accuracy. The Hendricks barn burned exactly as described. Sarah Williams returned from Colorado with a cast on her left leg, and the bridge washout occurred within minutes of the predicted time. Local authorities began asking questions when they realized that someone seemed to have advanced knowledge of accidents and disasters. But I couldn't provide them with any useful information about the caller's identity. The voice was always too distorted by static to recognize. The calls never lasted long enough to trace, and our primitive phone system didn't have caller ID capability. Station owner Bob Martinez initially dismissed the whole thing as coincidence and small-town gossip. But his attitude changed when the voice in the static started making personal comments about his own life. During a call in June 2004, the caller mentioned that Bob's wife was considering leaving him because of his drinking, and that she had already consulted with a divorce lawyer in Cheyenne. Bob had been hiding his alcohol problem from everyone in town, and his wife hadn't spoken to anyone about her marital troubles. Yet somehow the distorted voice knew intimate details about their private conversations and her secret meetings with legal counsel. The most chilling call occurred in September 2004, when the voice made a prediction that initially seemed impossible, but later proved devastatingly accurate. During a particularly severe thunderstorm, the caller's voice came through clearer than usual, and he spoke with an urgency that was different from his typical casual tone. He told me that Bob Martinez would die in a car accident on Highway 230 in exactly 4 months, on January 15, 2005. He described the accident with horrifying precision. Bob's truck would slide on black ice near mile marker 47, roll 3 times, and come to rest upside down in a drainage ditch. The caller even specified that Bob would be wearing his lucky red baseball cap and listening to a Merle Haggard song when the accident occurred. I was so disturbed by this prediction that I broke protocol and told Bob about it the next day. He laughed it off, claiming that anyone could predict he might have a car accident during Wyoming winter driving conditions. But as January 15th approached, Bob became increasingly nervous, even going so far as to avoid driving on Highway 230 for several days around that date. Unfortunately, a family emergency on January 14th required him to drive to Laramie to help his sister with their father's hospitalization, and he had no choice but to take Highway 230, the most direct route. Bob Martinez died in a car accident on Highway 230 at 11:43 p.m. on January 15, 2005. His truck slid on black ice near mile marker 47, rolled 3 times, and came to rest upside down in a drainage ditch. When emergency responders arrived, they found him wearing his lucky red baseball cap, and the radio was still playing a Merle Haggard song. Every detail matched exactly what the voice in the static had predicted 4 months earlier. The Wyoming State Patrol investigated the accident thoroughly, but their conclusion was straightforward. Winter driving conditions, excessive speed for the road conditions, and tragic bad luck. After Bob's death at Alvos, his widow sold the radio station to a corporate chain that immediately modernized all the equipment, installed digital phone systems, and moved the broadcast operation to a new building with better electrical grounding. The calls stopped as suddenly as they had begun. I finished my internship working for the new management, but the experience was completely different. No more strange voices, no more impossible predictions, just routine radio work in a sterile environment that felt nothing like the old Cray studios where the static had once carried messages from someone or something that seemed to exist between the frequencies. I graduated from college and moved to Denver, where I work now as a communications specialist for a technology company. But I still monitor Wyoming weather reports, and whenever severe thunderstorms move across the high plains near Rayfield, I find myself thinking about that distorted voice and wondering if he's still lost in the static somewhere, carrying knowledge of future tragedies that he's powerless to prevent. Sometimes late at night, when I'm scanning radio frequencies for work or hobby, I hear voices in the background noise that sound almost familiar. And I have to remind myself that not all communication travels through conventional channels, and not all broadcasters exist in the same dimension as their audiences. The new owners of Cray never experienced anything unusual, and the station continues to serve Rayfield with weather reports, local news, and country music, exactly as small-town radio stations are supposed to do. But the old-timers in town still remember the years when the static carried more than electronic interference, when someone lost between frequencies provided impossible knowledge about their private lives and accurate warnings about future disasters. They remember Bob Martinez, who laughed at a supernatural prediction until it killed him with precision that defied rational explanation. I never learned who or what the voice in the static really was. Whether it represented a person displaced in time, a consciousness trapped between electronic frequencies, or something even stranger that used radio waves as a medium for communication across barriers that science doesn't yet understand. All I know for certain is that for 2 years, the electromagnetic spectrum carried messages that transcended the normal boundaries of human knowledge, and that somewhere in the crackling interference of thunderstorms and electrical disturbances, there may still be voices trying to warn us about futures that haven't happened yet. Deborah Kane here. I've served as the Historical Society librarian and unofficial town historian for Blackstone Hollow, Pennsylvania, for the past 32 years. In that time, I've cataloged births, deaths, marriages, and every significant event in our small mining community. But there's one entry in my records that I update every single year without fail. March 15th, 1995, was the first documented occurrence of what residents now call the miner's lights. And for 30 years running, this phenomenon has appeared with the precision of a Swiss watch, defying every attempt at rational explanation and reminding our community that some tragedies refuse to stay buried. Blackstone Hollow was built around coal mining in the early 1900s. When the Pennsylvania anthracite boom brought hundreds of immigrant families to these mountains seeking steady work underground. The town reached its peak population of nearly 2,000 residents in the 1920s. With 3 active mines operating around the clock to feed the nation's hunger for clean-burning coal, the community that grew up around those mines was tight-knit and proud. With families that had worked underground for generations and children who expected to follow their fathers into the tunnels as soon as they were old enough. Everything changed on March 15, 1924. When mine shaft number 2 collapsed during the morning shift change, trapping 43 miners below ground and killing all but 7 who were rescued after 18 hours of desperate digging. The 1924 disaster effectively ended large-scale mining operations in Blackstone Hollow. The remaining mines were deemed unsafe after geological surveys revealed unstable ground conditions throughout the area, and most families moved away to find work in other coal regions. By the 1960s, our population had dwindled to fewer than 400 people, and all the mine entrances had been permanently sealed with concrete and steel to prevent accidents. The town survived on small businesses, farming, and eventually a modest tourism trade, based on our Mining Heritage Museum and the scenic beauty of the surrounding mountains. Life was quiet and unremarkable until that evening in March of 1995, when longtime resident Martha Patterson called the police to report strange lights moving through the sealed mine shafts. I was working late at the library that night, organizing mining records and personal accounts of the 1924 disaster for a historical display, when Martha's call crackled over the police scanner I kept on my desk. She lived in one of the old company houses about 200 yards from the main mine entrance, and she swore she could see lights moving inside the sealed tunnel, visible through cracks in the concrete barrier that had been installed 40 years earlier. The responding officer initially dismissed her report as imagination or possibly reflected light from passing cars. But when he arrived at the scene, he saw the phenomenon himself and immediately called for backup. What they witnessed that night established the pattern that has repeated every March 15th since 1995. Starting at exactly 9:17 p.m., which historical records show was the precise time the mine collapse occurred in 1924. Small points of light began moving through the sealed mine shafts, visible through gaps in the barriers and occasionally glimpsed through ventilation openings that had never been completely blocked. The lights moved in purposeful patterns, following routes that corresponded exactly with the tunnel layout documented in mining company blueprints from the 1920s. Most remarkably, the lights appeared to be generated by old-fashioned carbide lamps, the type of headlamps that miners had used in 1924, creating the distinctive white-blue glow that was different from modern electric illumination. Over the following years, the March 15th light phenomenon attracted increasing attention from residents, researchers, and curiosity seekers. The local fire department began posting volunteers at the mine site every year to manage crowds and document the occurrence, while I worked with state mining officials to obtain detailed maps and photographs of the sealed tunnels to better understand what people were seeing. Motion-activated cameras were installed at various locations around the mine entrances, and these devices consistently captured images of moving lights during the annual phenomenon. Though the photographs showed nothing more than glowing spots that could have been caused by any number of light sources. The breakthrough in understanding the phenomenon came in 2003, when a team of mining engineers from Penn State University gained permission to use ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging equipment to study the sealed mine system during the March 15th event. Their findings were published in the Journal of Mining History and created quite a stir in academic circles. The radar clearly showed the lights moving through areas where the mine tunnels should have been completely collapsed and filled with debris. More puzzling still, thermal imaging detected heat signatures moving along the original tunnel routes at depths where the temperature should have been constant and unaffected by any surface activity. The most compelling evidence emerged when researchers compared the movement patterns of the lights with historical records of the 1924 disaster. Mining company documents from that era included detailed shift schedules, work assignments, and evacuation procedures that specified exactly where each miner was supposed to be at the time of the collapse. When plotted on tunnel maps, the routes followed by the mysterious lights corresponded precisely with the paths that trapped miners would have taken while attempting to escape from various work areas toward the main shaft elevator. It was as if the lights were retracing the desperate movements of men who had died in those tunnels 71 years earlier. Local residents began reporting more personal connections to the phenomenon as word spread throughout the community. Several elderly residents claimed they could identify specific lights as belonging to deceased relatives who had died in the 1924 collapse. Sarah Mackenzie, whose grandfather Patrick had been killed in the disaster, insisted she recognized the distinctive pattern of his lamp movement. Apparently, Patrick had developed a habit of swinging his light back and forth 3 times before entering a new tunnel section, a safety ritual his granddaughter remembered from family stories. Similar claims came from other families with mining heritage, creating an emotional dimension to the phenomenon that went far beyond scientific curiosity. The annual occurrence became a community tradition, with many residents gathering at the mine site every March 15th to witness the lights and remember the miners who had died. Local churches began holding memorial services on the anniversary, and the Historical Society organized educational programs about mining history and workplace safety. The Pennsylvania State Historical Commission designated the site as an official historical landmark in 2010. Acknowledging both the 1924 disaster and the ongoing light phenomenon as significant aspects of the state's mining heritage. In recent years, technological advances have allowed for more sophisticated documentation of the March 15th lights. Digital cameras with enhanced night vision capabilities capture clearer images, while GPS tracking systems can precisely map the movement patterns. Electromagnetic field detectors register unusual activity during the phenomenon, and sensitive audio equipment has recorded faint sounds that some listeners interpret as voices or the echo of mining equipment. However, none of this modern technology has provided a definitive explanation for why lights appear to move through sealed, collapsed mine tunnels on the anniversary of a disaster that occurred nearly a century ago. The phenomenon has remained remarkably consistent over 3 decades of observation. The lights always appear at 9:17 p.m. on March 15th, regardless of weather conditions, lunar cycles, or other environmental factors. They follow the same general movement patterns each year, though there are subtle variations that suggest individual lights may take slightly different routes through the tunnel system. The duration of each appearance is typically between 45 minutes and 1 hour, ending as abruptly as it begins when the last light fades from view somewhere deep in the sealed mine complex. Attempts to access the sealed mine areas during the phenomenon have been unsuccessful due to safety concerns and legal restrictions. The concrete barriers were designed to be permanent, and removing them would require major excavation equipment and could potentially destabilize the entire tunnel system. State mining officials have consistently refused requests to open the mines for investigation, citing the risk of cave-ins, toxic gas exposure, and structural collapse that could endanger researchers and nearby residents. This means the lights can only be observed from the surface, leaving their ultimate source and nature forever beyond direct examination. The community of Blackstone Hollow has learned to live with its annual mystery, treating the March 15th lights as a memorial to the miners who died in 1924 and a reminder of the dangers that underground workers faced in pursuit of the coal that powered American industry. Children grow up knowing they will see the lights every year, and families plan their schedules around the phenomenon, gathering with neighbors and visitors to witness something that connects them to their town's tragic history. Whether the lights represent the spirits of dead miners, some unknown physical phenomenon, or something else entirely may never be determined. But their presence has become an integral part of Blackstone Hollow's identity. I maintain detailed records of every March 15th occurrence, documenting weather conditions, the number and behavior of the lights, attendance figures for spectators, and any unusual aspects of each year's phenomenon. These records now fill several filing cabinets in the Historical Society building, creating a comprehensive archive that future researchers may find valuable if scientific understanding of the lights ever advances beyond our current limitations. What I know for certain is that every March 15th at 9:17 p.m., the miners of Blackstone Hollow return to their tunnels one more time, carrying their lights through the darkness of sealed mines, forever trapped in the moment when the earth fell down around them and changed our community forever. Barbara Stevens, Coast Guard Aviation Survival Technician, Station Air, St. Augustine, Florida. 22 years jumping out of helicopters to save people who found themselves in trouble on the water. And I've seen just about everything the ocean can throw at you. Storms, accidents, medical emergencies, equipment failures. You name it, I've rappelled down to deal with it. But August 17th, 2017 was different. That was the day we found the Mary Catherine drifting empty 12 miles off Moonrise Bay, Maine, with her nets still deployed and fresh coffee still warm in the wheelhouse, but no sign of her 3-man crew anywhere. I was stationed temporarily at Group Southwest Harbor that summer, part of a personnel exchange program to help with the busy lobster season coverage. The distress call came in around 2:45 p.m. from another fishing vessel, the Sarah Jane, whose captain reported seeing a boat drifting without anyone visible on deck. The Mary Catherine was a well-known commercial fishing boat in those waters, a 42-foot lobster boat that had been working the Gulf of Maine for over 15 years under Captain Zainab Al-Hassan. She ran a tight operation with her 2 crew members, Anais Dubois and Greta Kowalski, both experienced fishermen who had been working those waters for most of their adult lives. When our MH-65 Dolphin helicopter reached the Mary Catherine, the scene looked normal from the air. The boat was drifting slowly with the current, her engines shut down, but no obvious signs of distress or damage. Her lobster traps were still deployed, the line stretching down into about 180 feet of water, which was typical for that fishing area. What wasn't typical was the complete absence of any human activity on a boat that should have been actively hauling traps. The pilot held us in hover while I scanned the vessel with binoculars, looking for any sign of the crew or evidence of what might have happened. The water conditions were perfect that day. Light winds, minimal seas, visibility unlimited. These weren't dangerous conditions for experienced fishermen. And the Mary Catherine was a seaworthy vessel that had weathered far worse storms without incident. Captain Al-Hassan was known throughout the fishing community as one of the most safety-conscious operators on the water, someone who followed all protocols and never took unnecessary risks with her crew. The boat's emergency radio beacon hadn't been activated, which meant either the crew hadn't had time to send a distress signal or whatever happened to them occurred so quickly they couldn't react. I was lowered to the deck of the Mary Catherine while our helicopter maintained position overhead. The first thing I noticed was how normal everything looked. The deck was clean and organized, fishing gear properly stowed, no signs of struggle or emergency. The engine compartment was secure, with no indication of mechanical problems or fire. In the wheelhouse, I found the coffee pot still plugged in with about half a pot of coffee that was still warm to the touch. The logbook showed normal entries up until 1:30 p.m. that afternoon, with routine notes about trap locations, weather conditions, and catch records. Personal belongings were scattered around the wheelhouse and cabin in ways that suggested normal activity rather than panic or emergency evacuation. Captain Al-Hassan's jacket hung on its usual hook. Anais had left her thermos on the chart table, and Greta's reading glasses were folded neatly next to the radio. The crew's lunch preparations were still visible in the small galley. Sandwiches wrapped in plastic, a bag of chips opened but not finished, and 3 cans of soda in various stages of consumption. Everything pointed to a crew that had been going about their normal fishing routine when something caused them to disappear. The most puzzling evidence was in the stern where the lobster traps were managed. 2 traps sat on deck, recently hauled and emptied of their catch, with the lobsters properly stored in the boat's holding tank. The trap lines showed no signs of unusual stress or damage that might indicate a crew member had been pulled overboard while handling equipment. The boat's safety equipment was all accounted for. Life jackets hanging in their designated spots, emergency flares unused, life raft still secured in its cradle. If the crew had gone overboard accidentally, they hadn't taken any safety equipment with them. While I was examining the vessel, our helicopter crew conducted an expanding square search pattern around the Mary Catherine, looking for any sign of the missing fishermen in the water. 2 additional Coast Guard vessels joined the search, along with several commercial fishing boats whose captains had known Captain Al-Hassan and her crew personally. The search covered over 200 square miles of ocean. Using every available resource, including thermal imaging cameras that could detect body heat even from significant distances. The official investigation lasted 3 weeks and involved Coast Guard marine casualty investigators, marine surveyors, and forensic specialists who examined every inch of the Mary Catherine looking for clues about what had happened to her crew. The boat's GPS system showed normal movement patterns consistent with fishing operations, with no unusual course changes or high-speed maneuvering that might indicate an emergency situation. The depth sounder and fish finder had recorded normal bottom readings with no indication of underwater obstacles or hazards that might have caused problems. Weather records for August 17th confirmed that conditions had been ideal for fishing operations throughout the day, with light winds from the southwest, seas less than 2 feet, and excellent visibility. Radio traffic from other fishing vessels in the area revealed nothing unusual, and several captains reported seeing the Mary Catherine operating normally earlier that morning. The last confirmed radio communication from Captain Al-Hassan had been at 11:20 a.m. A routine check-in with Harbor Patrol to report her position and estimated return time. The disappearance of 3 experienced fishermen from a seaworthy vessel in perfect weather conditions created intense speculation throughout the Maine fishing community. Some theories focused on the possibility of piracy or drug-related violence, though the valuable fishing equipment and boat itself had been left untouched. Others suggested a medical emergency that might have caused all 3 crew members to fall overboard simultaneously, though this seemed unlikely given their experience and safety training. Marine accident investigators considered the possibility of a rogue wave or sudden weather event that might have swept the crew overboard. But oceanographic data showed no unusual wave activity in the area that day. The theory of equipment failure was also examined, with particular attention to the possibility that the crew might have been pulled overboard while handling lobster trap lines. But the evidence on deck showed no signs of entanglement or equipment malfunction. The most disturbing aspect of the case was its similarity to other unexplained disappearances that had occurred in the Gulf of Maine over the previous decade. Coast Guard records documented at least 4 other incidents, where fishing vessels had been found empty and undamaged, with no trace of their crews and no logical explanation for what had happened. The pattern was troubling enough that some fishing families began avoiding certain areas of the Gulf, particularly deeper waters where several of the disappearances had occurred. 6 months after the Mary Catherine incident, I was transferred back to my home station in Florida, but I stayed in contact with the investigators who continued working the case. The boat was eventually sold to a fisherman from Nova Scotia, who reported no unusual problems during subsequent fishing operations. Captain Al-Hassan, Anais Dubois, and Greta Kowalski were declared legally dead after the standard 7-year waiting period, though their bodies were never recovered despite extensive and repeated searches. The case remains one of the most baffling maritime mysteries I encountered during my Coast Guard career. 3 experienced fishermen don't simply vanish from a properly equipped boat in perfect weather without leaving some trace of what happened to them. The complete absence of distress signals, emergency equipment usage, or physical evidence creates a puzzle that defies rational explanation. Theories about what might have happened range from the plausible to the paranormal, but none adequately account for all the evidence or the lack thereof. Local fishing communities along the Maine coast still talk about the Mary Catherine and her missing crew, especially when boats are preparing to work in the deeper waters where the disappearance occurred. Some captains refuse to fish alone in that area, insisting on traveling in pairs or groups for safety and peace of mind. Others have reported unusual experiences while fishing in the vicinity. Strange sounds from the water, equipment malfunctions that resolve themselves, or feelings of being watched while working their traps. I retired from the Coast Guard in 2019, but I still think about Captain Al-Hassan and her crew whenever I hear about missing fishermen or unexplained maritime disappearances. The ocean keeps its secrets better than any other environment on Earth. And sometimes people vanish into those depths, leaving behind only questions and the persistent hope that someday, somehow, we might finally understand what happened to them on that calm August afternoon when 3 experienced fishermen sailed into a mystery that the sea has never given back. Annika Patterson, emergency medical technician for Grundy County, Tennessee, 41 years on the job. I've responded to everything from barn fires to tractor accidents to heart attacks in church parking lots. But October 14, 1983, stands out as the most medically inexplicable case I've ever encountered. 23 members of the Hollow Oak Baptist Church congregation were found unconscious in their pews following what should have been a routine Sunday evening service. All breathing normally, but completely unresponsive to any external stimuli. With no detectable medical cause for their condition and shared memories of visions that challenged everything I thought I knew about the relationship between consciousness and reality. Hollow Oak Baptist Church occupied a modest white frame building constructed in 1948, situated on a gentle hillside surrounded by oak and hickory trees about 4 miles southeast of the main town limits. The congregation typically numbered between 25 and 30 people on Sunday mornings, dropping to 15 or 20 for evening services when work schedules and family obligations kept some members at home. These were salt-of-the-earth people: farmers, factory workers, retirees, and young families trying to make ends meet in an area where economic opportunities were limited, but community bonds remained strong. Pastor William Hayes had been serving this flock for 12 years, delivering straightforward sermons that focused on practical Christian living rather than theological complexity. The emergency call came in at 8:52 p.m. from Sarah Mae Henderson, whose husband Frank served as one of the church deacons. She had driven to the church to collect Frank after the evening service. Expecting to find the usual post-service socializing in the parking lot, where members lingered to discuss the week's events and make plans for upcoming church activities. Instead, She found all the cars still parked in neat rows beside the building, the lights blazing inside the sanctuary, but complete silence where there should have been the sounds of conversation and laughter. When she knocked on the front door, no one responded, though she could see through the windows that people were still seated inside the church. I arrived with my partner, Jim Morrison, 17 minutes after the call, expecting to find a medical emergency involving one or two individuals, possibly a heart attack or diabetic episode that had occurred during the service. What we discovered when we entered the sanctuary defied every protocol we had learned during decades of emergency medical response. 23 adults, ranging in age from 19-year-old Bellamy Richardson to 76-year-old Dahlia Foster, were seated in the wooden pews exactly as they would have been during a normal service, arranged in family groups with children next to parents and spouses side by side. Every single person was unconscious, their eyes closed and heads tilted back against the pew backs, but all showed normal breathing patterns and stable pulse rates. They appeared to be in the deepest possible sleep, completely unresponsive to verbal commands, physical touch, or bright lights shined directly into their faces. Most disturbing was the absolute uniformity of their condition. Not one person showed any variation in responsiveness level, and none displayed the restless movements or reflexive reactions that would be expected from people in normal sleep states. Pastor Hayes was found slumped forward over the pulpit, his arms hanging loosely at his sides and his head resting on the open pages of his Bible. His sermon notes were scattered across the floor around the pulpit, and his reading glasses had fallen off and lay unbroken on the carpet. The Bible was open to the first chapter of Ezekiel, which contains the prophet's famous vision of four-faced creatures with multiple wings and wheels within wheels filled with eyes. The church piano sat silent with its bench pushed back, but the hymnal remained open to "Holy, Holy, Holy," suggesting the service had been proceeding normally when the mass unconsciousness occurred. The physical evidence throughout the sanctuary indicated that whatever had happened occurred suddenly, but without panic or distress. Personal belongings remained exactly where they would have been during a normal service. Purses sat beside women in the pews, men's hats hung on the ends of pews, and small children's coloring books and crayons lay scattered on seats where families with young children typically sat. The offering plates remained on the communion table, filled with the usual collection of bills and coins that showed the service had progressed through the normal liturgical sequence before everyone lost consciousness. We immediately called for additional ambulances from surrounding counties and began the complex process of evaluating 23 unconscious patients simultaneously. Standard emergency protocols required that we treat this as a possible mass poisoning incident. So the Tennessee Emergency Management Agency was contacted to dispatch hazardous materials teams to test the church building for toxic gases, chemical contamination, or other environmental hazards that might have caused simultaneous unconsciousness across such a large group. The ambulance convoy that eventually assembled included vehicles from 5 different counties, along with paramedics, emergency physicians, and critical care nurses who had been called in from hospitals as far away as Nashville and Knoxville. Each patient required individual monitoring and care during transport, and the logistics of moving 23 unconscious people simultaneously stretched our regional emergency medical system to its absolute limits. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation opened a criminal inquiry within hours, initially operating under the assumption that someone had deliberately poisoned the congregation through contaminated food or water. All patients were admitted to intensive care units at 3 different hospitals, where they underwent the most comprehensive medical evaluation available in 1983. Blood tests, urinalysis, cerebrospinal fluid analysis, electroencephalograms, computerized tomography scans, and every other diagnostic procedure available revealed absolutely no abnormalities. Their vital signs remained stable throughout their unconsciousness. Their brainwave patterns showed normal deep sleep activity, and there were no traces of drugs, toxins, poisons, or chemical substances that might explain their condition. The environmental testing of the church building proved equally puzzling. Hazmat teams found no evidence of carbon monoxide, natural gas leaks, toxic mold, chemical spills, or any other environmental hazard that could have caused mass unconsciousness. Air samples, water samples from the church well, and soil samples from around the building all came back completely normal. The church's electrical system was thoroughly inspected for possible electromagnetic anomalies, but all wiring and equipment met safety standards with no unusual readings. What made the incident truly extraordinary was the precise timing of the mass awakening. After exactly 3 hours and 17 minutes of unconsciousness, all 23 patients opened their eyes simultaneously at 11:09 p.m., looked around in confusion, and began asking where they were and what had happened to them. Hospital staff who witnessed the awakening described it as one of the most eerie experiences of their medical careers. Watching 23 people in different rooms across 3 hospitals regain consciousness at precisely the same moment, as if responding to some invisible signal. The newly awakened patients remembered attending church, participating in hymn singing, and listening to Pastor Hayes begin his sermon on the visions of Ezekiel. But everything after approximately 7:52 p.m. was a complete blank. Medical staff conducted additional neurological evaluations after they regained consciousness, but the results remained completely normal, showing no evidence of head trauma, seizure activity, stroke, or any other neurological condition that might explain the mass unconsciousness episode. The most disturbing aspect of the case emerged in the weeks following the incident, when congregation members began reporting remarkably similar recurring dreams and visions. Despite having no conscious memory of the 3 missing hours, 17 of the 23 affected individuals experienced vivid, nocturnal visions that were consistent in content, terrifyingly detailed. They described encounters with beings of intense light that possessed multiple faces and wings that moved in geometrically impossible ways. Creatures that communicated through direct mental contact rather than spoken words. Bellamy Richardson, a local tobacco farmer who had attended Hollow Oak Baptist Church for over 25 years, reported recurring dreams of wheels within wheels spinning in the air above the congregation, their surfaces covered with eyes that seemed to peer directly into his soul with divine knowledge that was both beautiful and terrible. His descriptions matched closely with the biblical account in Ezekiel, though Bellamy insisted he had never studied that particular book of the Bible in detail and would not have been able to describe the prophet's visions accurately from memory. Dahlia Foster, a retired schoolteacher known for her practical nature and skepticism about supernatural claims, described dreams of 4-faced creatures with the heads of humans, lions, eagles, and oxen, surrounded by fire that produced no heat and light that cast no shadows. Her detailed accounts included descriptions of the creatures' movements, the sounds they made, and the overwhelming sense of divine presence that filled her with both awe and terror. Multiple congregation members independently provided similar descriptions, despite insisting they had not discussed their dreams with each other. Dr. Margaret Thompson, a psychiatrist from Vanderbilt University Medical Center, who was brought in to evaluate the affected individuals, noted that their shared visions corresponded remarkably closely with biblical accounts of angelic appearances, particularly those recorded in the books of Ezekiel, Daniel, and Revelation. What troubled her most was the consistency of details across multiple witnesses who insisted they had maintained no contact with each other and had not researched biblical accounts of angelic visitations. Pastor Hayes, who had been found unconscious at the pulpit, reported the most detailed and theologically complex visions. He described being transported to what he could only call the throne room of God, where he witnessed worship ceremonies conducted by beings whose nature transcended human understanding. According to his account, these entities delivered specific messages about spiritual warfare, the approaching end times, and the need for his congregation to prepare for trials that would test their faith beyond anything they had previously experienced. The psychological impact on the Hollow Oak congregation was profound and lasting. Several families stopped attending church services entirely, unable to cope with the recurring visions and the fear that the mass unconsciousness might occur again. Others became intensely devout, convinced they had experienced a genuine divine visitation that required them to completely restructure their spiritual lives and prepare for apocalyptic events. The close-knit church community, which had been stable for decades, fractured as members struggled to process what had happened to them. Pastor Hayes continued leading services for 6 months after the incident, but his preaching style changed dramatically. His formerly practical sermons about Christian living gave way to increasingly apocalyptic messages about spiritual warfare, divine judgment, and the imminent return of Christ. His detailed descriptions of angels with multiple faces and wheels filled with eyes made many congregation members deeply uncomfortable, serving as constant reminders of visions they were trying to forget or deny. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation concluded their inquiry in March 1984, officially classifying the incident as an unexplained medical event with no evidence of criminal activity or environmental contamination. The case file, which eventually grew to over 800 pages, documented every aspect of the investigation but reached no definitive conclusions about what had caused 23 people to lose consciousness simultaneously or why they had shared similar visions during their unconscious state. In June 1984, Pastor Hayes resigned from his position at Hollow Oak Baptist Church and entered a Trappist monastery in Kentucky, where he spent the remainder of his life in contemplative prayer and study of biblical prophecy. The remaining congregation voted to demolish the church building in 1987, citing ongoing anxiety among members who reported feeling uneasy whenever they attended services in the sanctuary, where the mass unconsciousness had occurred. The demolition crew found nothing unusual in the church structure, but within 2 years of the building's removal, all the oak and hickory trees that had surrounded the site began dying from an unknown blight that agricultural extension agents could not identify or treat. The property remained vacant for over a decade before being sold to a developer who built a small shopping center on the site. I retired from emergency medical services in 2008 after 41 years. But the Hollow Oak incident remains the most medically inexplicable case I encountered during my entire career. 23 people don't simultaneously lose consciousness for over 3 hours without a detectable medical cause. And they certainly don't share identical visions of biblical creatures while unconscious. Medical science offered no explanations in 1983. And despite advances in neurology and emergency medicine, it still cannot account for what happened in that small rural church on an October evening when ordinary people encountered something that transcended the boundaries of normal human experience. I taught elementary school in Sweetwater, Utah for 38 years, from 1975 until my retirement in 2013. And in all that time working with children from kindergarten through 6th grade. I never witnessed anything as profound and medically inexplicable as what happened during the 2001-2002 school year. 12 children in my district, ranging in age from 6 to 14, spontaneously began speaking fluent languages they had never been exposed to. Ancient Greek, medieval Latin, Coptic Egyptian, and dialects that linguistic experts from the University of Utah couldn't even identify. The phenomenon lasted 8 months, defied every medical and psychological explanation we could devise, and changed those families forever in ways that the community is still trying to understand. Sweetwater sits in a remote valley in southeastern Utah, surrounded by red rock formations and sustained primarily by cattle ranching and a small uranium mine that employed maybe 40 people during its operational years. The town never had more than 600 residents, and most families had been there for generations, descended from Mormon pioneers who settled the area in the 1880s. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where children walked to school without supervision, and where the most exciting events were high school football games and the annual county fair. The elementary school served about 90 children from kindergartens through 6th grade, all of them from English-speaking families with no exposure to foreign languages beyond the occasional Spanish words they might hear on television. The first incident occurred on September 12, 2001, just one day after the terrorist attacks that had the entire country on edge. 6-year-old Kaya Henderson came to school that morning speaking what initially sounded like gibberish to her teacher, Mrs. Patterson. But when the school principal, Mr. Chen, listened more carefully to Kaya's utterances, he realized she was producing structured speech with consistent grammar patterns and vocabulary, not the random babbling of a confused child. She continued speaking in this unknown language throughout the morning, occasionally reverting to English, but showing obvious frustration when she couldn't express certain concepts in her native tongue. By the end of that first week, 3 more children had begun exhibiting similar symptoms. Malaysia Rodriguez, age 8, started speaking what her mother initially thought was Spanish. But when they asked their neighbor who was fluent in Spanish to translate, he couldn't understand a word she was saying. 7-year-old Mariana Foster began producing elaborate sentences in a language that sounded vaguely European, but contained grammatical structures unlike anything her parents had ever heard. Most disturbing of all, 9-year-old Amaris Thompson started writing symbols and characters that resembled ancient hieroglyphics, covering page after page with intricate markings that followed obvious organizational principles. As word spread throughout the community, parents began bringing their children to the school for evaluation, hoping to understand what was happening and whether it might be contagious. The local doctor, Dr. Williams, initially suspected some kind of neurological infection or environmental toxin that might be affecting brain development and language centers. He referred all the affected children to specialists at Primary Children's Hospital in Salt Lake City, where they underwent comprehensive medical evaluations, including blood tests, brain scans, neurological assessments, and psychological testing. Every medical test came back completely normal. The children showed no signs of brain damage, infection, chemical poisoning, or psychological disorders. Their IQ scores remained in normal ranges, their physical development was appropriate for their ages, and they displayed normal social behaviors except for their mysterious ability to speak languages they had never learned. Most puzzling to the medical team was the fact that the children seemed to understand these languages perfectly, responding appropriately to complex instructions and engaging in sophisticated conversations when they encountered other children who were speaking the same unknown tongues. Barbara Williams, a linguistics professor from the University of Utah, spent 3 months in Sweetwater, documenting and analyzing the children's speech patterns. Her recordings revealed that 12 different children were speaking at least 6 distinct languages, some of which matched historical linguistic patterns from ancient civilizations. 10-year-old Bellamy Patterson was speaking what appeared to be classical Greek with pronunciation and grammatical structures that matched texts from the 4th century BCE. 8-year-old Dalia Rodriguez produced Latin that corresponded to medieval church documents, complete with specialized religious terminology that would have been unknown even to most Catholic priests. Most remarkably, the children were able to translate between their mysterious languages and English, demonstrating that they truly understood the meaning of what they were saying, rather than simply parroting sounds they had somehow memorized. When asked to explain concepts in English that they had expressed in their unknown languages, they consistently provided accurate translations and could discuss complex philosophical and scientific ideas that seemed far beyond their chronological ages and educational levels. The phenomenon attracted attention from researchers across the country, including linguists, neurologists, child psychologists, and anthropologists who were fascinated by the implications of children spontaneously acquiring ancient languages without any apparent source of learning. Several documentary film crews visited Sweetwater to record the children's abilities, and their footage eventually became part of research archives at multiple universities. The children seemed to enjoy the attention and were eager to demonstrate their linguistic skills, treating their abilities as natural and unremarkable. What made the situation even more extraordinary was the children's behavior when they encountered others speaking the same languages. Kaya Henderson and Amaris Thompson, who had never been particularly close friends, became inseparable when they discovered they could communicate in what linguistic experts identified as a dialect of ancient Aramaic. They would spend hours in animated conversations, discussing topics that their teachers couldn't follow, and sharing knowledge that seemed to come from sources far beyond their personal experiences or education. The parents of the affected children responded in various ways to their situation. Some families embraced the phenomenon as a miraculous gift, believing their children had been blessed with divine linguistic abilities for some greater purpose. Others were deeply troubled by the changes in their children and sought increasingly desperate medical treatments, convinced that some undiagnosed condition was causing the language acquisition. Several families left Sweetwater entirely, hoping that a change of environment might help their children return to normal development patterns. The Mormon Church leadership in Utah took an official interest in the case, sending representatives to interview the families and observe the children's abilities. Some church officials interpreted the phenomenon as similar to the biblical gift of tongues, while others expressed concern about potential supernatural influences that might not be divine in origin. The local bishop eventually issued a statement encouraging the community to support the affected families while seeking medical and spiritual guidance to understand what was happening. As mysteriously as it had begun, the phenomenon started to fade during the spring of 2002. The children gradually reverted to speaking primarily English, though they retained some ability to understand and produce words in their acquired languages. By June 2002, only 3 children still demonstrated any facility with their mysterious tongues, and their abilities seemed to be diminishing weekly. Malaysia Rodriguez was the last child to completely lose her linguistic gifts, reverting to monolingual English in August 2002, exactly 11 months after the phenomenon had first appeared. Follow-up studies conducted over the next several years showed that the children retained some residual knowledge of their acquired languages, though their fluency decreased rapidly once they stopped using them regularly. Psychological evaluations indicated that most of the children had positive memories of their linguistic experiences and expressed sadness about losing abilities they had found enjoyable and useful. None of them reported any negative physical or emotional effects from their mysterious language acquisition. The families affected by the phenomenon largely preferred not to discuss their experiences with outsiders, though several have maintained contact with researchers who continue to study the case. Some of the children, now adults, occasionally demonstrate fragments of their childhood linguistic abilities, particularly when they encounter written examples of the languages they once spoke fluently. The Sweetwater community has generally tried to return to normal life, though the incident remains a defining moment in local history. Medical and linguistic experts continue to debate the Sweetwater case, with theories ranging from mass psychological suggestion to genetic mutations to unexplained neurological phenomena. The complete absence of any identifiable cause or mechanism makes the incident one of the most thoroughly documented, yet completely unexplained cases of spontaneous language acquisition in medical literature. The children's abilities were real, their linguistic competence was genuine, but the source of their knowledge remains an absolute mystery. I retired from teaching in 2013, but I still think about those 12 children and the 8 months when my classroom contained conversations in ancient languages that scholars spend decades learning to read. Whatever caused those children to speak in tongues that predated their civilization by centuries remains one of the most profound mysteries I encountered during nearly 4 decades of working with young minds. Some gifts arrive without explanation and depart just as mysteriously, leaving behind only questions and the humbling reminder that human consciousness contains depths we have yet to fathom. My name's Elena Vasquez, marine archaeology graduate student at the University of Michigan. And in August 2012, I was part of a team conducting the first comprehensive depth survey of Elkwater Lake since the 1960s. What we discovered 200 feet below the surface of that pristine freshwater lake in northern Michigan shouldn't have existed, couldn't have existed according to every geological and historical record we had. Yet our sonar equipment and underwater cameras documented it with perfect clarity. A complete 1940s-era house, fully furnished and preserved, sitting on the bottom of a lake that geological surveys confirmed was a natural formation predating human habitation in the area by thousands of years. Elkwater Lake had always been something of a local mystery, a perfectly circular body of water nestled in dense forest about 12 miles from the nearest town of Lakewood, Michigan. The lake was popular with fishermen and summer campers who appreciated its crystal-clear water and abundant populations of northern pike and walleye. But its unusual depth had never been systematically measured. Local folklore claimed it was bottomless, though experienced divers who had explored the shallower areas around the perimeter estimated it might be 150 feet deep at the center. Our research project was funded by the Michigan Department of Natural Resources as part of a broader study of glacial lake formation and fish habitat management. I had joined the survey team as part of my graduate thesis research on underwater archaeological preservation in freshwater environments, expecting to document the typical debris found in most lakes: sunken boats, discarded appliances, maybe some Native American artifacts if we were lucky. Our equipment included state-of-the-art sonar mapping systems, underwater ROV cameras, and diving gear rated for depths up to 250 feet. The initial sonar sweeps revealed that Elkwater Lake was indeed much deeper than anyone had suspected, reaching a maximum depth of 247 feet at its center, with steep sides that dropped almost vertically from the shoreline. The anomaly appeared on our sonar screens during the 3rd day of mapping operations. At a depth of 203 feet, the sonar detected a large rectangular structure measuring approximately 40 feet by 60 feet, with what appeared to be a smaller attached structure that could have been a garage or outbuilding. The object showed clear geometric patterns inconsistent with natural rock formations or typical lake debris, and its position on the lake bottom suggested it had been there for a considerable period of time. Dr. Patricia Morrison, our team leader, initially suspected we had discovered a large piece of construction equipment or possibly a barge that had sunk decades earlier. When we deployed our ROV camera system to investigate the anomaly, what we saw on our monitors defied rational explanation. The structure was unmistakably a house, a 2-story colonial-style residence with white clapboard siding, green shutters, a red brick chimney, and a front porch complete with wooden railings and support columns. The house sat upright on the lake bottom as if it had been carefully placed there, with no evidence of damage that would be expected from a structure that had somehow fallen or been swept into the water. Most remarkably, A 1940s-era automobile was parked in what appeared to be a gravel driveway beside the house. The preservation was absolutely perfect. There was no algae growth, no deterioration of the wooden structures, no broken windows or missing roof shingles that would be expected after decades underwater. The car's chrome bumpers gleamed in our underwater lights, and we could clearly see intact headlights, an unblemished paint job, and even readable license plates. Through the house's windows, we could observe furniture, curtains, and household items arranged exactly as they would have been in an occupied home. It was as if an entire 1940s neighborhood had been flash-frozen in time and placed underwater. Dr. Morrison immediately contacted the State Historic Preservation Office and the Michigan Underwater Preserve Council to report our discovery, as protocol required for any significant archaeological find. Within 48 hours, our small research team was joined by experts in underwater archaeology, structural engineering, and historical preservation. The expanded team included divers qualified for deep water archaeological work, specialized cameras capable of documenting underwater sites, and historians who could help identify the period and origins of the structures we had found. The first manned dive to the house was conducted by Dr. James Patterson, a professional archaeological diver with over 20 years of experience in underwater site documentation. His descent to 203 feet took nearly 30 minutes due to decompression requirements, and his time on the bottom was limited to 15 minutes to ensure safe ascent procedures. What he reported upon returning to the surface challenged everything we thought we knew about the history of Elkwater Lake and the surrounding area. Dr. Patterson confirmed that the house was in impossibly perfect condition, with no signs of water damage, structural deterioration, or aquatic growth that should have occurred after years underwater. The front door was intact and appeared to be unlocked, though he did not attempt to enter the structure during his initial survey dive. Through the windows, he could see period-appropriate furniture, including what appeared to be a 1940s-era radio console, upholstered chairs in floral patterns typical of that decade, and family photographs displayed on tables and mantels. Most disturbing of all, Dr. Patterson reported that the house showed clear signs of recent habitation. Curtains hung properly in the windows, personal belongings were arranged on tables and shelves as if the residents had just stepped out, and there were no accumulations of sediment or debris that would be expected in an abandoned underwater structure. The automobile parked beside the house was a 1947 Chevrolet in mint condition, with readable Michigan license plates that historical records showed had been issued to a family named the Hendersons, who had lived in the area during the late 1940s. Historical research into the Henderson family revealed a puzzle that deepened the mystery of our underwater discovery. According to county records, Thomas and Margaret Henderson had indeed lived in the Lakewood area with their 2 young children during the 1940s, operating a small dairy farm about 5 miles from the current location of Elkwater Lake. However, township plat maps from that era showed no buildings or structures at the coordinates where we had found the underwater house, and geological surveys confirmed that the area had been covered by the natural lake for at least 10,000 years. Even more puzzling, the Henderson family had disappeared without explanation in November 1948. Local newspaper archives documented a brief investigation by county sheriff's deputies, who found the family's farmhouse abandoned with no signs of struggle or indication of where they might have gone. Their livestock had been left untended. Personal belongings remained in the house, and there were no records of the family relocating to another area or maintaining contact with neighbors or relatives. A second dive was planned to document the interior of the underwater house. But when our team returned to the site 3 days later, our sonar equipment showed nothing but the natural lake bottom at 203 feet depth. The house, the car, and all evidence of the structures we had photographed and videotaped had vanished completely. Repeated sonar sweeps of the entire lake revealed no trace of the anomaly, and the lake bottom showed the undisturbed sediment patterns typical of a natural freshwater environment. The disappearance of the underwater structures created intense debate within our research team and the broader archaeological community. All of our sonar data, video footage, and photographic evidence from the initial discovery were thoroughly analyzed by independent experts who confirmed that the images showed genuine structures rather than equipment malfunctions or digital artifacts. However, the complete absence of any physical evidence after the structures vanished left us unable to provide definitive proof of what we had documented. Dr. Morrison submitted our findings to the Journal of Maritime Archaeology. But the peer review process raised questions that we were unable to answer satisfactorily. Without physical artifacts or ongoing site access, our documentation of the underwater house remained in the category of anomalous observations rather than verified archaeological discoveries. The case was eventually classified as unexplained phenomena rather than a confirmed historical find. Local residents of the Lakewood area, when informed of our discovery, provided additional information that added to the mystery rather than resolving it. Several elderly residents claimed to remember stories their grandparents had told about a neighborhood that had existed where the lake is now, though no official record supported the existence of such a community. Some locals reported occasional sightings of lights beneath the water's surface during certain weather conditions, particularly on foggy autumn evenings. The Elkwater Lake incident became part of my doctoral dissertation on anomalous archaeological discoveries. Though I was never able to provide a satisfactory explanation for what our team had documented. The case remains one of the most thoroughly recorded yet completely inexplicable underwater archaeological discoveries in Great Lakes research. Our video footage and sonar data continue to be analyzed by researchers attempting to understand how a 1940s house and automobile could appear and disappear 200 feet underwater in a natural lake. I completed my graduate degree and now work as a marine archaeologist for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. But I still think about that August afternoon when I watched our underwater cameras reveal a perfectly preserved piece of 1940s America sitting impossible on the bottom of a pristine Michigan lake. Whether we witnessed some kind of temporal anomaly, underwater preservation phenomenon, or something even stranger remains an absolute mystery. All I know for certain is that sometimes the depths hold secrets that challenge our understanding of what is possible in the natural world. Sheriff Rick Thompson here. Served Meridian, Arkansas for 31 years before retiring in 2018. And in all that time dealing with everything from domestic disputes to drug busts to the occasional cattle rustling, nothing prepared me for what started happening in November 1998. The bell in our old Methodist church began ringing every night at exactly 2:47 a.m. despite being completely disconnected from any mechanical or electrical systems. And when townspeople gathered to investigate these midnight disturbances, we discovered that entire days had somehow vanished from our collective memory. 24 hours would pass on the calendar, but not one person in Meridian could account for what had happened during that lost time. Meridian was a typical small Arkansas town, population 847 according to the 1990 census, sustained by agriculture, a small furniture factory, and the kind of neighborly familiarity that comes from generations of families knowing each other's business. The Methodist Church had anchored our town square since 1923, its white steeple and bronze bell serving as both a landmark and a timekeeper for community events. The bell itself was a gift from the founding families, cast in 1922 and inscribed with biblical verses about time and eternity that seemed prophetic given what eventually happened to our town. The tower rose 63 feet above the church sanctuary, visible from every street in Meridian and audible for miles across the surrounding farmland when the bell was functioning properly. By 1998, the church bell hadn't rung in over 15 years due to mechanical problems with the clockwork system that had been installed during the 1950s. The bell rope had been removed for safety reasons after several incidents where children had pulled it inappropriately during services. The electrical connections had been disconnected during a renovation project in 1982, and even the manual lever mechanism had been disabled to prevent unauthorized ringing that might disturb the peace during late hours. Reverend Patricia Hayes had mentioned several times during church council meetings that repairing the bell system would cost over $8,000 and wasn't a priority given the church's budget constraints and the availability of electronic alternatives for calling people to worship. The first incident occurred on November 8, 1998, when the bell began ringing at 2:47 a.m. with the slow, measured tolls that had once called our community to Sunday services and marked significant events like deaths, weddings, and holiday celebrations. I received multiple phone calls from residents who were awakened by the sound, including elderly Mrs. Patterson, who remembered the bell's distinctive tone from her childhood and insisted that it sounded exactly as it had decades earlier. I drove to the church expecting to find vandals or some kind of mechanical malfunction that had spontaneously activated the bell system. But what I found was a completely normal church building with no signs of tampering. No evidence that anyone had accessed the bell tower, and no possible explanation for how a disconnected bell could ring with such precision and regularity. The bell continued ringing for exactly 11 minutes, producing the clear bronze tones that older residents remembered from decades past when the bell had marked the hours and called people to worship, then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. When I climbed the narrow wooden stairs to the bell tower the next morning with Reverend Hayes and church maintenance coordinator Frank Rodriguez, we confirmed that all the disconnected systems remained exactly as they had been left years earlier. The massive bronze bell hung motionless in its housing, showing no signs of recent movement or vibration that would be expected if it had been ringing hours earlier. There were no new electrical connections, no evidence that the manual mechanisms had been tampered with, and no way that anyone could have caused the bell to ring without leaving obvious traces of their activity, including disturbed dust patterns around the bell housing and mechanical components. The mystery deepened 3 days later, when the bell rang again at precisely 2:47 a.m., following the same pattern of 11 minutes of measured tolling before falling silent. This time, approximately 30 residents gathered in the town square to witness the phenomenon, including Mayor Patricia Chen, several church deacons, myself, and volunteer firefighter Captain James Morrison, who brought equipment to record the sound and measure its volume and frequency. We all heard the bell ringing clearly, the sound carrying across the quiet streets with the same authority and clarity it had possessed during its decades of regular operation. But when we examined the bell tower during and immediately after the ringing, we found no movement of the bell itself, no vibration of the metal that would indicate it was producing sound, and no source for the audio that was audible throughout the town. What happened next challenged everything I thought I knew about time, memory, and the nature of reality itself. After the second bell ringing incident, several residents mentioned feeling unusually tired and disoriented the following day, as if they had lost sleep despite getting their normal amount of rest and going to bed at their usual times. Martha Patterson, who kept meticulous daily journals documenting weather, visitors, meals, and daily activities, discovered that her entry for November 12th was missing entirely, though she clearly remembered writing in her journal every evening as she had done for over 20 years without missing a single day. When she checked her calendar, November 12th was marked with her usual appointments and reminders: a doctor's visit, grocery shopping, lunch with her sister. But she had no memory of attending any of those scheduled events or completing any of the activities she had planned. The pattern became undeniably clear after the third bell ringing on November 18th. Every single resident of Meridian experienced a complete memory gap covering the entire 24-hour period following each midnight bell episode. People would go to bed on November 18th after the bell finished ringing and wake up on November 20th with no recollection of November 19th. Despite clear evidence that they had lived through that day normally and completed their usual routines. Their calendars showed completed appointments with check marks and notes. Their kitchens contained dirty dishes from meals they couldn't remember eating. Their daily routines appeared to have been followed based on physical evidence like moved furniture and completed household tasks. But the memories were completely gone, as if that day had never existed in their consciousness. Dr. Margaret Foster, our only local physician who had served the community for over 20 years, initially suspected some kind of environmental contamination or mass psychological episode that might cause memory loss affecting the entire population simultaneously. She began conducting medical examinations of affected residents, looking for signs of poisoning, neurological damage, or psychological trauma that might explain the collective amnesia. However, every test she was able to perform with her limited rural medical equipment revealed completely normal results. Blood tests showed no traces of drugs, toxins, or chemical substances that might impair memory formation. Basic neurological exams were completely normal with proper reflexes and cognitive responses, and psychological evaluations indicated healthy individuals with no signs of trauma, depression, or mental illness that might explain the shared memory loss. The most disturbing aspect of the phenomenon was its absolute consistency across the entire community, without any exceptions. Every single person in Meridian experienced identical memory gaps covering exactly the same time periods. Regardless of age, health status, location during the lost time, or any other individual factors that might affect memory formation. Children couldn't remember going to school, playing with friends, or eating meals their parents had prepared. Adults had no recollection of work activities, household chores, conversations with family members, or any of the routine activities that normally filled their days. Even visitors who happened to be in town during the bell-ringing episodes, including traveling salesmen, delivery drivers, and relatives visiting local families, lost their memories of the affected time periods just like permanent residents. Arkansas State Police investigators became involved after the fourth incident in December 1998, when the phenomenon was being described in news reports as a mass psychological event of unknown origin that might represent a public health emergency or environmental disaster. The investigation team included medical experts from the University of Arkansas Medical Sciences, psychologists specializing in mass hysteria and collective behavior, and specialists in environmental hazards who conducted extensive testing of our water supply, air quality, soil conditions, and potential sources of chemical contamination that might cause widespread neurological effects. They tested for everything from natural gas leaks to industrial pollutants to biological toxins, but every test came back completely negative, with no evidence of any substance that could cause memory loss. The investigators also interviewed dozens of residents, documenting their experiences and looking for patterns that might explain the memory gaps. What they discovered was even more puzzling than the initial phenomenon. During the lost time periods, people appeared to have continued their normal activities and routines with no indication of confusion, distress, or abnormal behavior. Store owners found their cash registers balanced correctly with sales receipts for the forgotten day. The post office had mail sorted and delivered according to normal schedules. The elementary school showed evidence that classes had been conducted, with lesson plans completed and assignments graded, though neither teachers nor students remembered anything about those school days. The bell-ringing phenomenon continued with mechanical regularity through 1999 and into 2000, occurring approximately every 3 to 4 weeks with no discernible pattern beyond the consistent timing of 2:47 a.m. and duration of 11 minutes. Each episode was followed by a complete memory gap affecting every resident, and each lost day left behind physical evidence of normal activities that no one could remember performing. The community learned to prepare for these episodes by leaving themselves written instructions for essential tasks, ensuring that critical services like medical care and emergency response could continue operating even if the people responsible for them couldn't remember their duties during the affected periods. Local businesses were forced to adapt to the phenomenon by implementing systems that could function during the memory gap periods without requiring conscious decision-making from employees or owners. The bank installed automated systems for essential transactions and emergency access to safety deposit boxes. The hospital developed protocols for handling medical emergencies during lost time, including detailed written procedures that staff could follow even without remembering their training or previous cases. Utility services were automated as much as possible to prevent service interruptions that might affect the entire community during the forgotten days. Life in Meridian took on a surreal quality as residents learned to live with the knowledge that approximately 24 days per year would be erased from their memories, leaving behind only physical evidence of activities they would never recall. Some families began keeping detailed video diaries, hoping to document their experiences during the lost periods. But they discovered that electronic recording equipment malfunctioned during the memory gap days, producing only static or blank recordings despite appearing to function normally. Even written notes and journals from the affected periods were found to be illegible or completely blank, as if the act of memory loss somehow extended to physical records created during those times. The psychological impact on our community was profound and lasting, affecting every aspect of daily life and social relationships. Some families left Meridian entirely, unable to cope with the regular loss of memory and the uncertainty about what happened during the gap periods. Particularly parents who were concerned about their children's development and education being affected by the missing days. Others became obsessively focused on documenting their lives through photography, detailed schedules, and elaborate systems designed to preserve evidence of their activities during the forgotten periods, though these efforts consistently failed due to the apparent inability to retain any record of the lost time. The town's population dropped dramatically from 847 residents in 1998 to fewer than 400 people by 2005, as families relocated to escape the phenomenon, and few new residents were willing to move to a community where nearly a month of each year vanished from memory. Local businesses struggled to maintain operations with reduced customer bases and the ongoing challenges of functioning during the lost days. The economic impact was devastating, with property values plummeting and the local tax base shrinking to the point where basic municipal services became difficult to maintain. Religious interpretations of the phenomenon varied widely among the remaining residents, with some viewing the bell ringing as divine intervention and others seeing it as evidence of supernatural forces beyond human understanding. Several residents believed the memory gaps represented protection from awareness of some greater tragedy or spiritual warfare occurring during the lost time periods, suggesting that the community was being shielded from experiences too traumatic or significant for human consciousness to retain. Others interpreted the memory loss as a form of divine judgment or testing, though no clear religious message or purpose emerged from the experiences despite extensive prayer and theological study by local clergy. Reverend Hayes struggled to provide spiritual guidance for a phenomenon that defied theological explanation, and left her congregation questioning fundamental assumptions about time, memory, and divine intervention. Her sermons during this period focused on faith in the face of mystery and the importance of community support during unexplained trials, but many parishioners found it difficult to maintain their faith when confronted with evidence that reality itself might be unreliable. She eventually left Meridian in 2003, accepting a position at a church in Little Rock where she could minister to people whose lives followed more predictable patterns. Scientific researchers from universities across the country studied the Meridian case throughout the early 2000s, bringing sophisticated equipment to monitor brain activity, electromagnetic fields, and environmental conditions during the bell-ringing episodes. However, none were able to identify the mechanism causing the bell to ring without any apparent power source or the neurological process that resulted in community-wide memory loss. The phenomenon appeared to violate fundamental principles of physics, neurology, and chronology, making it impossible to develop testable hypotheses about its causes or effects. The case was eventually classified as an unexplained anomaly and removed from active research consideration when funding agencies decided that resources could be better spent on more conventional scientific investigations. The bell-ringing episodes began occurring less frequently after 2005, dropping from monthly occurrences to quarterly, then annually, before eventually stopping entirely in December 2009 after more than 11 years of regular incidents. The final episode followed the same pattern as all previous occurrences. The bell rang for 11 minutes starting at 2:47 a.m., followed by a community-wide memory gap covering the next 24 hours. When residents awoke on December 15, 2009, they discovered that the massive bronze bell had developed a large crack running through its center, splitting the metal in a way that would have prevented it from producing sound, though no one remembered hearing it break or experiencing any unusual sounds during the final ringing. I retired as sheriff in 2018, but I still live in Meridian and still think about those 11 years when our community existed partially outside normal time and memory. We lost approximately 240 days of collective memory during that period, 240 days that we lived through but can never recover. 240 days of experiences that shaped our lives in ways we will never understand. Whether those lost days contained experiences too terrible to remember, too wonderful for human consciousness to retain, or something else entirely beyond our comprehension, remains one of the great mysteries of my life and the defining experience of our community. The Methodist Church still stands in our town square, though the congregation has dwindled to fewer than 20 regular attendees. But the cracked bell was removed in 2010 and replaced with an electronic system that plays recorded chimes for Sunday services. The old bronze bell sits in storage in the church basement, still cracked and forever silent, serving as a physical reminder of the 11 years when Meridian existed between the seconds of normal time. Those of us who remained in the community rarely discuss what happened during those lost years. But we all carry the knowledge that reality is far more fragile and mysterious than most people ever imagine, and that time itself might be more negotiable than we'd like to believe. If you've enjoyed these spine-chilling tales from small-town America, remember to subscribe to Verified Fears for more documented mysteries that challenge everything you thought you knew about the world around us. These aren't just stories. They're reminders that the impossible happens more often than we'd like to believe, and that sometimes the greatest mysteries are hidden in the most ordinary places, waiting to disrupt our comfortable assumptions about how reality works.